Exorcist: The Beginning released in 2004 after some bizarre production troubles, but it wasn't well received by critics and didn't bring in much money, so an alternate version of it that was shot before was brought back to life after being scrapped with a few reshoots, and in 2005, the movie was released titled Dominion, Prequel to The Exorcist. It features many of the same actors and locations and even follows a loosely similar story, but the movies are quite different. Okay, so now let's take a look at the first to be made but second to be released of the Exorcist prequels. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. We're on to the last Exorcist review before Believer comes out later this week, and it's been a wild ride of some masterful filmmaking, followed up by dog shit, and then amazing. It's a weird series. Dominion is the fifth entry in the franchise, but it was actually made before Beginning, and they loosely tell the same story. It's an insane production story that I went into more detail about in my review for Beginning, so I won't take up time going through it again, but if you're interested in why these two movies exist and why there are two consecutive prequels that tell a very similar story, go check out that video and then come back here. Dominion released in May 2005 and had a better critical reception than Beginning, but still didn't do all that well. It seemed at this point that audiences were pretty tapped out from this franchise, and I don't really blame them because the original and Legion were amazing, but 2 was so bad, and then there was this generic prequel that got sorta remade a year later, so it was probably a really weird time for anyone to be invested in the overall story. A lot of the same cast from Beginning was also used in Dominion, with a few exceptions like Gabriel Mann playing Father Francis instead of James Darcy, and the Doctor being played by Clara Beller and having a name switch. Because there are a lot of similar plot points with these two movies, and they overall share a similar story, I won't be reiterating too much of what I said in the review for Beginning, and a lot of this will serve as a sort of comparison between these two movies. Really weird situation, but let's take a look at Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist.
Anyway, we won't know more about it until we get inside the thing.
In Beginning, Merrin's backstory from World War II was slowly drip-fed and hinted at throughout the movie before being fully revealed, but here we see the whole scene play out at the opening. It's one of the few things that was relatively unchanged aside from how the reveal was paced, but you'll see a distinct difference in the presentation from this first scene alone. Beginning was very flashy and cinematic, but Dominion was going for a more natural approach like the original movie. On the surface, that does seem like a good thing, and in some ways it is, but the thing with that approach is that the characters and narrative need to be strong enough to not make everything boring. It can be more immersive if it's pulled off properly, but if you don't have some interesting cinematic flair or engaging writing, then it's really easy to completely disengage with the movie altogether. I'd heard that Dominion was a more candid movie, which made me excited because there were things I really liked about Beginning that I thought would work well with that sort of presentation, but honestly, from this first scene, I started rethinking what this movie would be. It's very true that there's more of that documentary feel from the original movie that we love, but, well, that was like the most compelling documentary you've ever seen. This feels more like the regular host was sick when they were filming, so they had to settle with someone with absolutely no on-screen presence to teach you about tree pigmentation, which he didn't even know was a topic until this morning. I have no idea where that analogy came from. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that Dominion is a slow-paced movie that can feel very slow-paced, if that makes any sense. I didn't find this scene as impactful because it feels a little barren compared to the way it was presented in Beginning, which was overly cinematic. I would have liked something in the middle. A Nazi soldier was found killed in a ditch, and as a form of revenge, this man decides to set an example for the others by forcing Father Merrin to choose 10 of them to be killed, otherwise they'll all be gunned down right here. He initially refuses, but he's forced into it to ensure that at the least, some of these people will be able to walk away, so he begins pointing out the ones he feels are the most expendable. I'm not sure if I prefer starting the movie off with this scene in its entirety or slowly revealing it like they did in Beginning. This makes it feel, to me, a little disconnected from the rest of the movie, whereas in Beginning it was weaved in with the plot that was going on. It was slowly unveiled as you had scenes that would tie into what happened. The reason that I like how the backstory was revealed in Beginning more is that it makes you wonder about why Merrin left the priesthood. The event was slowly drip-fed, but since we had that right away, it feels like a less interesting plot. Dominion is a more character-driven movie, but I just found this to be a less impactful way of delivering that backstory because it doesn't leave the question open. Because of the way I heard people talk about these two movies, I didn't expect to be comparing Beginning favorably to Dominion at all, but I really do think this was done better there. The other thing that sets me off right away is how flat this movie can look. Beginning was, again, it was very overly cinematic, but Dominion is like the exact opposite side of that spectrum, and it just kind of looks a little bland. I think what I'm realizing is that if there could have been a version that met these two movies halfway, we might have had a really solid movie on our hands. Anyway, we pick back up in East Africa, where Father Francis and the Sergeant Major watch Merrin from a balcony. One spot where Dominion tends to be a much better movie is in the dialogue, which feels a lot more natural, partly thanks to how much more the camera is allowed to linger and give the scene room to breathe.
And he's standing in the church now?
Undecided.
This time around, Merrin's already in Durati by the time we meet him, and he's called in to talk with these two, so no collector of ancient relics looking to hire him to find the Pazuzu head. Father Francis has been sent to oversee the dig to make sure that it's treated with the respect for its religious importance. A moment ago, I said that Merrin left the priesthood, but that's not actually quite the case in this movie. He's on sabbatical leave from the church at the moment, and there are concerns about having a priest on sabbatical run the dig, so that's why Father Francis was sent out. Basically, he's a potential blasphemer's babysitter. Merrin, Francis, and their translator Chuma make their way to Durati, where they meet Rachel, this movie's Sarah. Just like in Beginning, Merrin notices that the church's condition is nearly perfect, which indicates that it must have been buried immediately after being built.
But the wind and sun up here.
Well, they should be badly weathered.
Also, one of the workers has a breakdown that Chuma claims is just because of working so hard in the intense heat. Anyway, he's hauled off for medical attention, and this is all pretty similar to Exorcist Beginning, but where it starts to veer off in another direction is when Merrin meets Cheche, a deformed boy who's wandering the site on his own, but he disappears like Michael on laundry day when Merrin gets distracted by a truck. Cheche's been showing up around the site every once in a while, and we learn that he's been getting hurt by some of the locals because they think he's cursed. One thing that I noticed about Dominion is that this dig goes by incredibly fast. Remember how much was buried last time we saw it? Look at it now. I'm not saying this is a timeline error, by the way. I'm just pretty sure Merrin is bribing the workers with meth. Well, it looks like that paid off in the end, because now they can finally enter the church and have a look around. And just like in Beginning, the spears in the hands of the angels that would usually be pointing up to exalt heaven are instead pointing down. And Merrin finds out why when he discovers an underground cave below the church. In that cave is a large monument of a demon, and after piecing together that this was used for human sacrifices, Merrin realizes that the church was built over this cave to seal away whatever evil the people who built it believed was down here. After this discovery, Father Francis insists that he has to inform Major Granville about what they found so that a detachment of guards can be sent to watch the place and keep looters away, which is an idea that Merrin isn't all too fond of. I wonder why.
And I can oblige.
Oh, yeah, no, that tracks. Wind back the clock a bit to after the detachment arrives, and two guards were standing watch outside the church when they snuck inside to steal valuable jewels that were inlaid in the stone. The next morning, they're found hung up in the church gutted, which the lieutenant assumes was done by the Durati locals to scare away the British. I like how the movie sets up that Granville wanted the locals to be given respect and seemed to have a pretty steady head on his shoulders.
And I don't want to display even a hint of disrespect, now or at any other time. Am I clear?
Because that makes his retaliation feel uncharacteristic, which gives the idea that whatever evil is locked away in that church is having an effect on people. He goes into the town square demanding that whoever was responsible has to confess, and you can probably see where this is going, and it plays out exactly the same way as it does in Beginning, at least initially. Where Dominion vastly overshadows Beginning is in the way that it handles the character-driven side of the story. There's a lot more focus given to things like questions about faith, morality, and responsibility, and that's where the movie is the most successful overall. Bringing that backstory around in the way they do is a great way of delving into the idea of evil being this ever-present and persistent thing that comes in all shapes and sizes, and it results in the frightening realization that it never really ends. You can make it through one horrifying thing, but before you've even processed it properly, you could be thrust back into a situation that brings it all back into your life, and that's a reality that Merrin's having to face now. That's the kind of thematic depth that made the original Exorcist so good, And where that's concerned, Dominion is the far better movie. Not compared to the original, compared to Beginning. And that's also not to say that it reaches the same levels that the original did, but it does all of this a lot more effectively than anything in Beginning. Now, all that being said, the question of entertainment value comes up whenever I think about the differences between these two movies. Beginning is a very heightened, more intense, and less deep version of this narrative, while Dominion is a much more insightful and character-driven experience. I think that's really well illustrated when we look at the way Granville's character is handled. Beginning had that crazy scene where his pinned butterflies decide to take revenge on him, and he almost shoots himself in the head with next to no hesitation. By almost, I mean he does actually shoot himself, but it's not out of guilt. It's not something that's related to any sort of remorse for what he did. It's just because he thinks he's going crazy. Dominion explores his actions more by showing him be very remorseful for what he's done, and that's really important because the way it's handled in Beginning makes it seem like he just sucks, but with the way we see him demand that the Dorati be treated with respect and the clear regret he feels for what he did, it makes it seem like the Valley has a lingering evil that makes people act in a way they normally wouldn't. His arc comes to a close when he sits alone in silence and shoots himself in the head after realizing what he's done. It's a darker end for the character, but it's one that's more thematically relevant. So that's where Dominion easily bests Beginning, but I genuinely have a harder time trying to figure out which one I'd rather watch again. On one hand, I think Dominion would be a more interesting rewatch because there's probably more to it that I'd pick up on the more I watch it, just given the nature of its script. It's more exploratory and probably rewards rewatching more, but the reason I'd find it hard to choose is just because I honestly don't find it to be a particularly engaging movie. It's true that it does more with its characters and has more depth to its narrative, but the issue is that I find a lot of the movie to be kind of boring. The performances aren't strong enough to make that sort of deep character exploration work in the way that it does in the original. You'll get a long, drawn-out monologue like when Father Francis is dying, but it comes across way too flat to have any sort of impact. I found Dominion to be a little difficult to engage with at times, and while Beginning is an objectively worse movie that's so goofy and over the top, I found it to be more entertaining than the often uninteresting narrative in Dominion. I love the setting of the story for both of these movies, but the actual through-line narrative of this movie didn't really grab me. Speaking of the story itself, the possessed character here is different than the last time. There it was the doctor/love interest, but here it's Cheche, which should be fairly obvious. Throughout the movie, his body miraculously recovers from the condition it was in when we first met him, but that's no touch from God. This whole thing is where I really start to have issues with Dominion. Demon Sarah in Beginning was so insanely stupid in every measurable way, and I'd assumed since most of Dominion was so much more grounded than that movie, that would translate to the way it handled the possessed character, but holy sweet good God almighty, is this also stupid.
Don't ever touch me with that again, priest!
It gets even weirder at the end, which I'll be getting to in a moment, but once Cheche's possession starts to make itself known, it's such an insanely jarring transition from the tone of the rest of the movie. You go from this slow burn, character-driven narrative to suddenly breaking any immersion you might have built up to that point by doing a literal glowing red-eyed demon that floats around. It's ridiculous, and it was a huge issue I had with this movie. It feels especially goofy when it's juxtaposed with scenes like this one, where young children are brutally murdered in a classroom because they're Christian and the Dorati are afraid of what Christianity has brought to them. It's really gruesome and genuinely disturbing, and then we're right back to where we were in Beginning, laughing hysterically. Okay, maybe it's not that goofy. I'll give it that. It's not as goofy as Demon Sarah. Nothing is as goofy as Demon Sarah. It feels really weird going through the major plot points of this movie since I just talked about a lot of them in the review for Beginning. There are some differences in the way they play out or the way they're handled, but overall there's a lot of similar beats. I've gone over the biggest differences, but a lot of the other ones would just be me comparing two events and wouldn't be very interesting, so I'm going to get into how the movie ends now, so skip to the conclusions chapter to avoid getting that spoiled. Merrin gets to the church where Cheche is held up. The climax is far more subtle than the beginning, which had that absolutely hilarious ending. I fucking love it. I love the climax in Beginning. There's a lot more in the way of the demon taunting Merrin and trying to get inside of his head to manipulate him, just like we saw Reagan do with Father Karras. Things get really wild here, and I think this is why I struggled so much with this movie. You have this really character-driven, grounded story that gets halted by this bizarre ending with this insane shit going on. It's more strange than it is the over-the-top stupidity of Beginning, And there is something really interesting about this sly, slithering demon trying to get into Merrin's head and the otherworldly visuals outside. What I do really like about the ending is that the demon presents Merrin with an opportunity to change the past, which is a really interesting moral dilemma for the movie to use. In the hallucination, he refuses to do as the Nazi commanded, and everyone there along with Merrin is killed. The swirling lights outside represent the evil in the valley returning to infect everyone near it with a darkness, and violence begins breaking out as Rachel attempts to kill herself. The Dorati charged the British as retaliation for the execution earlier, and a man is seen beating the shit out of his wife. Well, Merrin does end up returning to his former self and performing a successful exorcism on Cheche after a very quiet and atmospherically interesting sequence, and the evil is locked away once again. Merrin winds up back in the Roman collar, and an elder warns him that while he succeeded in freeing the people here of that evil, the demon that he faced will chase him and they will meet again. Cheche starts working at the hospital alongside Rachel. The British army departs, allowing the Dorati to return to a better life, and Merrin makes his way back to Rome with his faith restored. So there you have it. Definitely the better version out of the two prequels, and a far more interesting telling of this exorcism than the prequel bits in Exorcist 2, but the movie is far from perfect. It can be really dull at times, and I think the best version of this would have been somewhere in the middle of these two prequels. It's far more in line with the style of the original movie, and there's some really interesting exploration of morality and guilt that's handled pretty well. I also like how it dealt with religious fear. You know, you had the locals butchering those children just because they were Christian. That kind of stuff is handled well. I always like movies that raise the question about like religious perspective, because there's so many different religions. How does any one person know that theirs is the right one, you know? So I appreciated that quite a bit. The ending is very unique stylistically. It's shot decently enough, and while it's far from a must-watch, I wouldn't say stay away from it. It's worth it for the curious, but not really a necessity. With that, I have now reviewed all of the movies in the Exorcist franchise, and on Friday I'll have a review out for the first new entry in this franchise for 18 years. The Exorcist Believer is right around the corner, and after that I'll have a ranking video out for the series next week. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.